I thought I would do is open up by talking a little bit about other areas of research. I'm a bad role model for assistant professors because the good career has like 1 or 2 primary research programs, and I'm scattered. I have several different lines. They have underlying themes to them, but I have a lot of different approaches that I take. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, give you a sense of my breadth, and then I was going to talk about 3 experiments that we did with comprehension. So, first research program that I have, as was already alluded to, it goes back, I was thinking about this the other day, actually 30 years, which is sort of depressing, when I did my first attitude accessibility study. And generally what I do at this point I won't do because we're eating and there's drinks and I don't want anything to be spilled, but usually at this point I'll say, oh my God, a cockroach! And people will jump and all these things as a way to highlight attitude accessibility. What we're interested in when we look at attitude accessibility is ease with which an attitude is activated from memory. And generally when we say cockroach or you see a cockroach, you don't have to think, okay, cockroaches have diseases and that's highly likely to be true. They're ugly and that's highly likely to be true, and so forth. We don't think about these things in a way like, for example, Fishbein hypothesized people develop attitude. We have an attitude stored in memory and it's highly accessible from memory. We don't have to even think about it, it's activated in there. And that's what we're talking about with attitude accessibility, is this continuum from highly accessible automatic attitudes to attitudes that are not accessible or even stored in memory at all. And looking at that continuum, we study it because we find that attitudes that are more accessible from memory are more functional. A lot of my work lately has dealt with adolescent risk behavior. This is stuff that Nancy and I have been doing, looking at smoking, alcohol, a number of different domains there, and looking at the role of attitude accessibility both in predicting behavior and explaining. Attitude accessibility, I'm actually more interested in it as a defense mechanism. What we find is that when you have an accessible attitude, it operates to help maintain itself in a dynamic manner so that it doesn't change. And then also, how does it influence message processing? Also, I do a lot of work within the mode model. The mode model is a dual process model that looks at spontaneous versus deliberative behaviors, which is a distinction I think our discipline doesn't make enough. I think that most of the theories that we use are more interested in deliberative behaviors, because a lot of the behaviors that we're interested in are more spontaneous. And so the mode guides a lot of my work in this area. I recently had a paper come out in Comm Theory where we've also been looking at ambivalence. So that's when we have conflicting attitudinal reactions to an object. And we're looking at both the metacognitive components with ambivalence in terms of like my confidence in my beliefs, as well as more accessibility and how those two interact to influence ambivalence. And then I've been very interested, this is an area of research that I haven't started yet, but I've been interested in looking at. Attitude accessibility starts with behavior. We find that when people engage in a behavior, it makes that attitude more accessible. And social media is about behavior, whether it's liking posts on Facebook, about retweeting posts that you've seen, retweeting tweets. These are all behaviors that we're engaged in. And we have a lot of explanations for why our countries become more polarized in the political sphere. And I think the social media play a role in that. And we think attitude accessibility may actually be a mechanism of that. Inherent, an affordance of Facebook and tweeting and so forth is the engagement in these behaviors, which should inherently increase the accessibility of those attitudes. And attitudes that are more accessible guide how what we attend to in the environment, how we process messages. That processing tends to be more biased, all things that we characterize as partisan. And so we want, this isn't, like I said, a program of research that started yet. This is in its planning stages, but one of the things we want to look at. Another area of research that I've done a lot in is racism. I'm not going to talk about this very quickly. Morgan Ellithorpe was one of my students. She talked about this work this fall, and that was a lot of the work that, all that work that she talked about, stuff we've done together. But we've looked at it from a cultivation theory perspective. How does heavy exposure to media influence racial attitudes? And we find, consistent with other data, that people who watch a lot of media tend to have more racist attitudes. They tend to have more racist implicit attitudes. But within the mode framework, we're also interested in motivation. And what we found, interestingly, is that heavy media use is tied to more egalitarian motivations. So that if I watch a lot of media, I have this sort of paradoxical increase in implicit racist attitudes, but the motivation not to be racist. And that has implications for spontaneous versus deliberative behavior. So that media may, in a deliberative context, decrease our racist behavior, but in a spontaneous context, increase our racist behavior, which is something we see going on in this country quite a bit. We're also very interested in genre effects. We have a data set that we just got where we demonstrated that people who watch a lot of sports program have more implicit racist attitudes, which goes along with there's a number of excellent content analysis of sports programming demonstrating it's fairly racist. Morgan did this paper that's in press now at CR looking at supernatural genres, and actually find that supernatural genres with mixed race casts, such as Sleepy Hollow, decrease racist attitudes, whereas supernatural genres with all-white cast increase racism. And it operates through, the supernatural genre makes us think about ourselves as humans. And so we go to a more superordinate level of categorization. And when we have an all-white cast, we don't think humans. What we generally find is we think white humans. But when you have a mixed race cast, you tend to think humans in a more inclusive sense. And it has effects on in this particular study, we had an African-American cast member. It was a written text, but we had pictures. But that influenced attitudes towards both African-Americans and other minorities. So it was really operating through this level of categorization, which we found very interesting. Where everybody in our culture knows the stereotype of African-Americans. And we find that sometimes that knowledge predicts people's racist behavior. And oftentimes we say that we acquire that racist knowledge through the media, but no one's ever looked at that. And using a scale that Mark Zana had developed, not a scale, it's a technique that he had developed for measuring implicit attitudes, we demonstrated, albeit it's a weak effect, but we did demonstrate that heavy exposure to media, and primarily using, looking at elementary school exposure. So people's recall or the recollection of elementary school exposure, in particular, really predicted these kids' understanding of the racist, of the stereotype across the culture. So it does influence this cultural knowledge. More recently, I did some research that tested both dissonance theory and also work on bounded reciprocity. It tested dissonance theory because despite the fact in the early 90s demonstrating one of the first dissertations demonstrating a link between violent video game play and aggressive behavior, I let my kids play Halo. And of course that causes dissonance. And so I have to address that, and so one of the things we looked at is cooperative gameplay. Most of the work on violent video game play has looked at solo gameplay, and yet surveys find that people prefer to play cooperatively, and in fact they prefer to play what we call cooperative competition, where you play with teams against the machine or teams against other teams. And in fact, the genre of games that has the most cooperative opportunities is shooters. In a content analysis we did of sales on Amazon, 90% of the different shooter games that sold allowed cooperative gameplay. And we're interested about that. And we want to look at what's the effects of cooperative gameplay. So we've done a number of studies in that domain. Looking at it from the theory of bounded reciprocity, which is an alternative to social identity theory, which is a theory I tend to not like very much. It's a fine theory, people don't test it right, in my view. But essentially, what we demonstrate is that when you play a game competitively, you get the standard effects, that it gives an increase in aggression on the standard measures of aggression. When you play a game cooperatively, it's as if you didn't play the game in terms of aggressive measures. And we increase pro-social behavior towards people you don't even know in terms of a prisoner's dilemma task. We demonstrated this even when we had OSU students playing against a Confederate in a Michigan t-shirt. That in that situation, when they played competitively, they did not cooperate afterwards. But when they played cooperatively for 15 minutes, it was as if they were best friends forever. I mean, no difference between the Confederate wearing an OSU t-shirt versus wearing a Michigan t-shirt. So this is work that we're very interested in. What we're wanting to explore now are, can we use NPCs for the same things, or non-player characters? So if you're familiar with a game like The Last of Us, where it's a solo game, so you would think there's no room for cooperative behavior, but there's this little girl that you have to help throughout the game. And we're wanting to explore, we're just beginning to explore, does that have the same effect as cooperating with real people? And the theory of bounded reciprocity would say that that should be the effect. We're also interested in shooters and affiliation. Why is it that 90% of shooters have cooperative gameplay? Because when you look at theories like the GAM, if I'm playing a shooter, I should be frustrated, I should be aggressive, I shouldn't like the other person. But yet we find that these games, in terms of sales, the ones that allow cooperative gameplay are the ones that sell the most. More so than even sports games, which are known for cooperative gameplay. And what we're thinking is affiliation motivation may explain this. And essentially, we're motivated to affiliate with other people when we're threatened. Think about when you've been in an emergency situation, people come out, like we got hit by an F4 in Tuscaloosa, and I talked to neighbors I'd never seen. Because you just want to be with other people in that context. And even though we know we're not going to die in a shooter game, Annie Lang's work has shown that at some level in the primitive brain, we're processing this in the same, Renee Weber's work also as well has demonstrated this. In the primitive brain, we're processing this as if we're being threatened. And we think that increases people's desire to be with other people when they're playing violent games, which then leads up to cooperative gameplay. And so we think it's a very interesting dynamic there as well. Other research that we're getting ready to do, which makes me very excited about the prospect of moving up here, is with the coping power intervention. Coping power is an intervention that John Lockman developed 30 years ago. And it's aimed at kids who are at risk for delinquency. And it has 30 years of evidence base that it does very well at long term, keeping these kids out of prison. So it's a very good intervention. The problem with it is that it's 2 years long, and a lot of schools don't want to do it because it's 2 years long in junior high. And so I worked with John, so we developed together with some creative, part of a creative team, to develop a series of animated cartoons with Captain Judgment that went along with each of the 36 sessions that were there. And we've demonstrated that we can now make the Captain Judgment cartoons part of a web-based intervention. So it's now a year long. So it's much more efficient for the schools. The cartoons reinforce the behaviors that they're already learning through the one-on-one with the clinicians. And what we're wanting to do is develop a video game that these kids can play after they're done. In fact, in focus groups, the kids would say, oh my gosh, we'd love to have a video game with Captain Judgment. And it's a really cheesy cartoon. And I'm sort of embarrassed that it did win a Telly. But sort of embarrassed by it. But they want this, and the idea is, can we develop this animated cartoon as a serious game to help reinforce the intervention that these kids have already gone through, to even increase the longer term, the spontaneous behaviors that they've been doing more deliberatively. I'm also more recently doing work on what we call the TVOTS model, which is a model of entertainment, where we argue that entertainment and transportation is driven by the self. And so part of it is we want to be entertained when we're tired of dealing with ourselves. So, for example, if we have people do a lot of self-regulation, which is very effortful, when we deplete that resource pool, we find that people are more transported than if we haven't depleted that resource pool. And the idea is, I'm tired of dealing with me, I want to get out of me. And the idea is that increases the desire for transportation. Another thing that TBOTS predicts is that it draws from self-determination theory, in that we're motivated to seek entertainment to help fulfill various goals, such as confidence, feeling more confident about ourselves, and it provides us a way to explore facets of ourselves that we can't explore in a day-to-day setting. I shouldn't admit this, but I used to do that with Dungeons and Dragons. So I had a thief because I wanted to know what it would be like to be a criminal, and so I could explore that facet of myself, or a potential facet of myself. And we have a study that's under review at JOC right now where what people think of as counterintuitive, but it's a straight prediction of this theory. When we self-affirm people, so we make them feel good about themselves, the theory would predict that, in fact, they won't be transported because they don't need it, and that's exactly what we found. Compared to just the control subjects, which were just undergraduates coming into the lab. When we self-affirm them, they're not as transported, they don't find it as entertaining, they're lower in identification with the characters. The area where I'm wanting to explore this now, though, is not really an area where we're talking about people seeking entertainment, but it's where they will write entertainment. And I've become fascinated with fan fiction. And a lot of evidence out of fan fiction suggests that these people write fan fiction as a way to explore facets of themselves that they normally can't explore. As an example, I should be watching time, so I have time to talk about it. One genre of fan fiction is called slash. And slash fiction is when you take what are perceived to be heterosexual characters. So, for example, in Star Trek, which is where the first slash really emerged with Kirk and Spock, and you write homosexual erotica. So you have them in a homosexual relationship. Now what's interesting, and that's interesting, it makes sense. You're taking the characters and you're driving them in new ways. But what's interesting is who writes this. So Henry Jenkins, who's a cultural scholar, has done a lot of work in this area. And he finds who writes slash fiction, who writes homosexual erotica, is heterosexual women. And the question is why? And what they say universally is it allows me to explore a sexual relationship with co-equals, which is not something I see in the media, and it's not something I get in my day-to-day life. And we find across a lot of different fan fictions that in at least qualitative interviews of it, that fan fiction is serving as a way for people to explore facets of their lives that they desire but they're not getting in their day-to-day settings, which is again straight out of the T-Bots perspective. We did a, just to justify that this is important to look at, and people actually did it, we did a very quick and dirty Mturk survey of 700 people. We found, obviously this is going to be biased because this is Amazon, but we found that 9% of them report that they've written fan fiction, and over 40% of them report that they read it. And Amazon, I don't know if you've heard of Amazon World or not, but Amazon World is where Amazon has gone and negotiated the copyright, and it's only publishing fan fiction, which to me says it's worth, it's something that's real. How many of you watch Sherlock? That's fanfic. That's fan fiction. 50 Shades was fan fiction off the Twilight series. Fan fiction is a part of our culture, and we're wanting to explore why is such an important part. It's emergent, it's very, very important, especially with the internet. We haven't done any data with this yet other than that one study. We're wanting to do a big data where we look at, there are literally millions of pieces of fan fiction online. And we want to look at the linkages, so we're wanting to do a big data project with that. I also do work with cultural models, which are essentially mental models that are shared, so it's shared knowledge. I'll talk about this a little bit at the end, so I won't mention it anymore. And then comprehension, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So like I said, I'm not a great role model for graduate students where you want to have a career that has one or two dominant areas. I tend to be a little scattered. Underlying most of these is the notion of accessibility, and that's a big part of the comprehension work. But what I'm going to do today is talk about 3 studies. The first one is looking at comprehension of short TV clips, where we're modeling and predicting people's memory for the clip based on theories of comprehension. And it's going to be merging 2 different models of text-based comprehension, the landscape theory and the event indexing model. We'll talk about those in a little bit. And then we're going to look at full-length feature films. So we're taking these models that work very well with short clips, and we're going to look at a whole movie. And then we're going to look at it in terms of health narratives, health literacy. So we're going to look at, can we use these to predict people's memory that they get from reading pamphlets about autism? And that will be the 3rd study. So, and I want to say thank yous. These are 3 graduate students I work with. Courtney is going to be on the job market next year. And I've had the joy of working with a number of graduate students. Courtney is the best all-around student I've ever worked with. Sheena Alay got her master's at OSU and unfortunately went to Northwestern for her Ph.D. She was a great student to work with. And then Ashley Kennard, I'm directing her dissertation right now. She wants to go private sector, so I won't push her to a bunch of academics. So she's very interested in autism and does a lot of work in that area and studying that. She wants to work in the autism community. So, comprehension and memory. The underlying idea behind this work is when we're looking at comprehension, people form mental models or situational models. This follows out of Van Dijk and Kinch's work from 1982. And a situation model is our representation of events within a story. So if you think of Hound of the Baskervilles, when you think about Holmes the first time he goes out on the moors, that would be a situation model, in that a story is made up of a series of these situation models that represent the various events. And so we're looking at how is this information from a film combined with existing world knowledge and stored in memory. And we test this by then, we model what we think is the representation, and based on that model of the representation of the story, we predict people's memory for the story. So that's the basic logic behind it. So we're going to use a hypothesized representation to predict their memory for it. Okay? So the landscape model is one of the earliest models in this area. It's a model of text comprehension. It does an extremely good job of predicting people's memory for texts. And it was developed by Vandenbroek and colleagues, but Paul Vandenbroek is the person who's done most of this work. And so it looks at coherence and the representation based on the activation of concepts as you're processing the story. And so it's going to look at processing across time in very small chunks. In text-based, it's going to look at the level of the sentence. Obviously, we have to do it slightly differently with video. And so there's three ways in which concepts are activated. One is just the number of times a concept is activated in a story is going to influence its representation. The degree of activation, that concepts can vary in how active they are. And so the degree of activation across the story. And then what I think is the most interesting, but we can't tease these out, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is the association between items that are co-activated. So that's where you really start to get the structure. If the two concepts are co-activated, they're going to be linked in memory. And that's where we really start to get that situational model emerging from it. It was originally tested with audiovisual text in a thesis that I directed with Mina Lee back in 2008, and my now ex-wife was a part of this as well, and that was published in Discourse Processing. And we found that the original model did a really bad job. We had a 2.5-minute CNN story that they watched or read. With the text-based version, which is what the model is designed to do, it accounted for about 60% of their memory, which is, the R squared is 60, not an R of 6. We're accounting for 60% of the variance in their memory. That's pretty good. But the original model for the audiovisual accounted for about 25% of the variance, which is still respectable, but we wanted to do better than that. And the distinction between audio and text-based processing is that visual component. And Alan Pavio had developed a model of memory, the dual code theory, or dual code hypothesis, where we argued we have two separate memory systems, one for verbal and one for visual. And so we essentially dual coded the landscape model and assumed a representation that was an independent visual and an independent verbal. And when we did that, we're back to accounting for about 80% of the variance. So that did a very, very good job of predicting, but we wanted to replicate that. So that's the dual code landscape, is where we assume two different representations. So the creation of situation models was the other thing we're interested in. Vandenbroek only is looking at activation concepts. He's not looking across time. How do you form different situation models? And that's essentially done through event segmentation. Remember, we think that situational models correspond to events in stories. And so event segmentation, the idea there is that how people segment events is going to map onto that mental representation of separate situational models. And these models are going to be formed together then to create an overall global model for the story. So the event indexing model is Ralph Swan, and for whatever reason I like to use Dutch when I'm studying comprehension. So Dutch scholars. Swan is also from Netherlands. Swan assumes that there's 5 dimensions of comprehension, that we encode along these 5 dimensions: time, space, causation, motivation, and then the entities, which can be things and people in the story. And so that anything that's going on that we're representing in memory is along those 5 dimensions. And the importance of this is, first of all, for change. So as these dimensions change, if there's a radical change, so we're in a scene and all at once we switch time, space, and the entities that are involved with it, we're going to form a new situational model because everything's changed. And so there's so much discontinuity, it's a new event. And then we're going to form linkages between these separate situational models for the story, because we don't want them independently floating around there, by linkages along these 5 dimensions. And we also find that one of the big parts of comprehension, a lot of people think comprehension is driven by forward inferences, predictions what's going to happen. It actually plays, in my view, in my reading the literature and our own work, very little role. It's actually backward linkages. How does what I'm looking at now relate to things in the past? And that's also driven along these 5 dimensions. So that's why we're looking at this model. Swan assumes that the 5 dimensions equally are important for comprehension. So he doesn't think any of them are weighted more than others. I disagree with that. And so we wanted to look at that in this first study. So what we're going to do is look at comprehension of entertainment clips. So we're going to replicate that original study that Mina Lee did, but instead of using a news story, we're going to use 5 different types of entertainment clips across different genres. And instead of just looking at the landscape model, we're also going to incorporate the event indexing model into that. So these are the 5 shows, just like 2.5-minute clips from these different 5. You have to identify all the concepts that are relevant along those 5 dimensions in the clip, and these are the number of concepts in each one of these. Okay? So it's a lot of coding. And in this study, we looked at every 4 seconds. So for every 4 seconds, we watch the clip, and then we code the degree of activation for each of these concepts for each 4 seconds in a clip. And so we get a very rich representation across time. And it's called the landscape model because if you map it out concepts by time, with higher elevation, meaning more activation, you get this nice little landscape with mountains and valleys and that correspond to the activation levels. Okay, so we divided it into 4 second segments, like I just said. And then we coded them originally on how we look at the original model, which is they're just watching it as we normally watch TV, and we coded it that way. For the dual code representation, what we do, to get the verbal dual code, we black the screen. And so they're just listening to the audio, and we code that. And for the visual component, we turn off the sound, and they just code the visual. And the two don't correlate that high. So they're independent, I mean, not independent, but fairly independent representations. And then we code them for each of those concepts, for each of those 4 second segments. So it's very, very intensive coding in terms of presence, importance, and explicitness, and they can get a 0, 1, or 2. So each concept in each segment gets a code between 0 and 6, which represents theoretically the degree of activation of that concept. And then we create a network where we correlate, well, actually it's a multiplicative function, between those items that are active at the same time. So it's a lot of fun math, and that's why you have graduate students to do that. No, I'm sorry, I didn't say that. So they're all, and then also we coded all the concepts along those 5 dimensions. And that's how we're incorporating the event indexing model here, is we're going to look at those concepts across the 5 dimensions. We did collapse time and space because using very short clips, there wasn't much variance along there. We never had more than well, in one of the clips, the Once Upon a Time in the West, we had 3 different spatial locations. Otherwise, it was always just 1 or 2. And time, except for in in 2 of the clips, time varied. So there wasn't a lot of variability going on. Recall the clip. When they get done watching the clip, and these are the number of subjects we had, they ranged from 74 to 125, depending on the clip. After they got done watching the clip, and we'd have them do some filler counts, we'd ask them, just tell us, summarize the story for us, being as complete as you can. So they're just going to summarize the story. And then we code the number of times each of our concepts is mentioned in their summary. And that's the memory item that we're going to try to predict. And we can do it 2 different ways. We can simply do mention, not mention, which gives a very restricted range, or we can look at the average number of times a concept is measured, and that's what I'll be reporting here. I can tell you the other data as well. The fits aren't as well, but they're still very, very respectable. Okay? So again, the average number of times a participant mentioned each concept is what I'm talking about here. So this is for the 5 clips. This is for the single code model. So the original one that we found didn't work very well. We did a couple of changes this time. We used the event indexing model to guide how we identified the concepts. We did shorter segments than we did in the original study. And then we had a more explicit coding scheme, which I just showed you. So those are 3 improvements we did because our betas our fits are going to be a little better. So the worst case is we accounted for 63% of the variance in people's memory for the story, which we're really happy with. It's one of those things where you're really happy because you're getting a great fit, but if you're wedded to the dual code model, which I was like, oh crap. There's not much room for improvement here because these are already good fits. So this is the data for the dual code model. In every case, this is a significant improvement on the fit. So with the dual code version of the model, we're accounting for a minimum of 87% of the variance in people's memory. We think it's doing a pretty good job of capturing their memory for the story. That's a long ways from where we ultimately want to get, but this is, we think, a very good start. We want to move beyond just memory as a measure, but anyway. The other thing we did with the event indexing, remember we took each of those concepts and we coded them along those 5 dimensions. And we used Hayes' process macro and looked at, did those moderate the effects on memory? So essentially, is the participant concepts more likely to be recalled, or are the causation concepts more likely to be recalled? And that's the question we're trying to ask here. And we found that, in fact, that worked. These are all the significant moderations that we got. So across the board, the people moderated. People were more likely to remember the people. Many of the clips, causation was a very important one. Time and space didn't do a whole lot, but we didn't have much variability in that. And motivation, again, motivation is something that develops across time, but again, it didn't do a whole lot. And so we think that the merger of these 2 theories is going to be very fruitful, and we're exploring that now with, we have 2 more data sets since then where we've been looking at that. So anyway, the original landscape model did a very good job here, but we think the dual code landscape model does even better. And we think the implication for scholars such as ourselves is we have to understand that there is both a verbal and a visual component to people's memory, and sometimes those are independent of each other. Now, if you're studying film, a lot of times that doesn't matter because American filmmakers suck, excuse my language. We need more Hitchcocks, in which case it does matter because Hitchcock was very good at the visual, but most filmmakers use the dialogue as a scaffolding for bad visual. As we look at film, and I think in new media this becomes particularly important to look at because oftentimes there's a really clear disconnect between the visual that you're seeing and the verbal that's there. I mean, think about a lot of posts on Facebook. In those, they very well be 2 independent representations that have independent effects on people's behavior, but that's something we have not explored at all, as far as I'm aware, and I think is a very important thing, and this research points to the necessity of doing that. And then we think that this data provides initial evidence for the merger of the event indexing and the landscape models being very fruitful. The next study is then taking us, we were looking at 2.5-minute clips, and one of the reactions is big deal. So you can predict memory for 2.5-minute clips 15 minutes later. So we want to, that's up the ante. But the problem is that the landscape model looks at the smallest unit of meaning. So we've always looked at small things. And so in text, that's sentences. In the Lee study, we looked at what we thought corresponded to sentences in text, not edits. Magliano at Northern Illinois says, no, it has to be edits, and that doesn't make any sense at all. And we can talk about that later if you want, and we're arguing about that right now as he's one of my reviewers of a manuscript we have out. And so we're looking at, in the Mina study, we had a 2-minute video and we had 19 segments. And in this other study, we were looking at every 4 seconds. So if we think about that for a movie, a 2-hour movie, that would mean we're coding 1,100 units if we're extrapolating from Mina's data. With what we just did, it would be 1,800 units. And then you have all the concepts in the movie, which are going to be more than you have in a 4-minute clip. And it just becomes unfeasible. And that's when I have, protests and lockouts and stuff like that in my lab. And I say, well, let's do a movie. And they're like, no, that's not. And so we looked at the event indexing model. Remember, the event indexing model doesn't look at the smallest unit of meaning. It looks at events and argues that those are represented as coherent situational models. And so what we did in this study is we used the event indexing model to identify events within a movie as opposed to looking at these very fine grain. And then we're going to look at the activation of concepts within each of those events. So we're looking at a much larger unit. And so at one level it may not work because it's a much grosser analysis. But on the other hand, if we think that these events are what make up our representation of the story, looking at the activation of concepts within those events should be able to predict memory for the story. So our hypotheses were that the landscape model and the dual coding landscape model would in fact predict memory, and that the dimensions of the event indexing model, again, would moderate that. So essentially, we're just predicting that we're going to replicate what we got with the short clips. So we had 65 students watch a full-length feature film, and she didn't put the title in there. Courtney didn't put the title in there. I'm blanking on the title. It's a really bad rom-com that we did with, oh shoot, I'm just completely blanking. I apologize. If you want to know, I can send you that in an email. We divided it based on the event indexing model into 93 segments, so a lot better than 1,800 segments. And then we coded within each of those segments the same way we did those short clips. And we're going to see if we can predict memory. There were 63 concepts, so we didn't go as fine-grained as I would have liked, but this was manageable. So the 63 major concepts within the theory, within the movie, guided by those 5 dimensions from the event indexing. So this is the landscape and the dual coding landscape model. And the landscape model accounted for 91% of the variance in people's memory, which blew me away. I made Courtney go back and actually do that by hand because I didn't believe it. And I oftentimes will make students do things by hand if I don't believe it. The dual code model didn't account for much more variance, but it was a significant increase in variance. It just added 1% more variance, but it was a significant increase. But we didn't find that the dimensions identified in the event indexing model moderated in this instance, like they had in the films in the earlier study with the short clips. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So, landscape model worked well at the level of the event for the big story, which we think is important. Again, the dual code model works better, not a whole lot better, but it does add explanatory power for it compared to the original model. Now, Swan, remember, he had the assumption when he originally proposed his event indexing model that the 5 dimensions are equal, it doesn't matter. So our results, which are of course null results, but are consistent with what he hypothesized. Most people doing research in this area say, well, that's not really the case. And in our earlier study with the short clips, we found that it moderated. What we think is going on, and this is stuff that's, I mean, this data analysis is like a month old. And so there's still a lot of things we're digging with this data, and there's still actually more data we're gathering about the film. So this is ongoing data. But what we think is going on is across an entire film, the 5 dimensions may wash out. But generally, screenwriters will cut a film into 5 sections. First 10 minutes are to introduce the characters. And we think if we look at it that way, in the first 10 minutes, the entities are going to do a lot of the variance. Then you have the precipitating event that starts the story. Well, then cause and effect should moderate it. Then a lot of the movie is motivation to overcome this barrier, and then so in other words, we expect the different dimensions to emerge in different parts of the film. And in addition, we think that different dimensions are going to play more of a weight in different genres of films. So motivation and cause and effect may be more important in mysteries than they are going to be in romantic comedies. And my own hypothesis that in good films, the dimensions may play more of an effect than in bad films, but that's just my bias on this film. So anyway, that's where we're at this point with that. Practical implications of studying comprehension. I mentioned before the coping power intervention that we've done, and I want to develop a video game that reinforces that intervention. But when we constructed, I talked briefly about, we constructed these 36 episodes of Captain Judgment. And I helped with the writing of those, and it was written based on these 2 models to try to increase the backward inferences that kids were making to earlier concepts, so they're coming up with more integrated representations and better memory for the key concepts. There's no way to test whether that worked or not, but the intervention has worked very well, and so I'll say, yeah, that's great, but I can't say that it worked well, but we think that's evidence that it's working. We did Moonhee Yang, who's another one of my students. We have a paper in JOC where we use the landscape model to predict product placements. The more activation that a product placement should have, according to the landscape model, maps out very nicely into their memory for the product placement. So items that, based on that coding scheme, they're going to have more activation, are better remembered than items that have lower levels of activation. And the third thing is health literacy. And I'm nervous about talking this about here. I get talked about as a health person. I do a lot of work in health, but there are a lot of people who know health a lot better than I do, so I may get in trouble. But what we've done here is looked at health information pamphlets in comprehension. The work we've been doing is focused mostly on narrative. Even when we're doing the CNN, it's a CNN story, so it's this encapsulated story about a robot expo. And most information pamphlets are written in an expository text, so maybe bullet points and stuff like that. And so can we use this model to predict memory for expository text when it was designed for narrative text? And so essentially, are the theoretical frameworks for comprehension, and we're going to look exclusively at the landscape model in this study, able to identify and predict comprehension of expository text? Health literacy is looking at least in the area we're looking at, with mass media, where health campaigns, it's looking at people's capacity to obtain and process and understand basic health information when it's presented versus in different types of health-related campaigns. There's a lot of variation in how well people do that and how well they extract information from the campaigns. And researchers, and generally what that research has said is use simpler text. So use it at a lower level of grade. And what we think is missing from this literature is they haven't considered the work on situational models. They haven't considered the work on text comprehension. And we think that that can inform our understanding of health literacy. And this was pilot data for what will initially will be an R23 and then hopefully an R1 at NIH. So what we're asking, first of all, is can the landscape model predict participants' memory for health information in expository text? This is just going to be the straight landscape model, not the dual code, because this is going to be brochures that we're looking at. And then can we manipulate it so that we will create, the subjects will create situation models? And the reason is that when information is encapsulated in a situational model, people's memory goes up. And so we wanted to try to manipulate these brochures to try to make it so that subjects were creating situational models. First of all, narrative increases the likelihood of creation of situational models. Providing context, this is work that Bransford and Franks did years ago. And so in this context, we either identified the brochures about autism or just no context, which is what the original brochure was, and then having protagonists. People tend to develop situational models around protagonists, so we manipulated those three things. So we took a pamphlet that is at the Autism Center at Columbus right now, which is a national autism center, very well respected. We took one of their brochures and we manipulated it. So either it was narrative or expository. So this would be like the narrative. We make it so as many children grow up, so it's more story-like. We had context or no context. So here we say it's about autism, here's nothing said. And the original pamphlet says nothing about autism, but it's for identifying developmental milestones, so you can see if the child is developing autism or not. And then protagonists. We added kids' names in there or not. So here it's no protagonist. Here's in the expository text where we have Jack. And so we have different kids for different age groups. Admittedly a weak manipulation, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then after they're done reading the pamphlet, again, to address your question, they weren't told that their memory was going to be there, but we asked them to recall as much of the information from the pamphlet as we could. Okay. So, results for the landscape model. This was predicting for the 4 different expository texts. So this is no protagonist. This is protagonist and context, no context. This was actually the original pamphlet. But you can see across the board, the landscape model does a very good job of predicting people's memory for that expository text. It also did a very good job of predicting people's memory for the narrative text, and across all 4 conditions, the narrative text, the landscape model did a better job of predicting, which we think is interesting. But again, the point is that the landscape model did and again, the landscape model, in my view, is a fairly impoverished model, but it does a very good job of predicting for people's memory. So there's a lot of room here for ways we can improve the model. Then the other thing, and so, yeah, we think the landscape model can predict people's memory. And this means that we should be able to design these pamphlets so that people are more likely to remember what we want them to remember, based on principles within the landscape model. Multiple repetitions, critical events co-appearing in the same sentences, things like that. That should result in a stronger representation. So we expected a throughway interaction. Remember, we did these 3 things to try to get them to form situational models. We had it as narrative. We thought when there's a protagonist, and we thought when there's context, it would show the best memory. That was not significant. Instead, this is what we got. There was a 2-way interaction, so that expository text with no context had the best memory, which is not what we would want. But that showed the best memory for it. That was disappointing. And so we went back to the data and looked at it. One of the things that you do when you're trying to identify, so we did a follow-up analysis on it with additional subjects. We did an event marking task. So what you do is you have participants go through the narrative, go through the text, and they mark where there's new events. And that's how and generally that's the idea of identifying those events that correspond then to situation models of memory. Again, we think the landscape model is a viable way to predict people's memory. It may not be that and we can use that. Then again, your question is a very good one. Are they predicting the memory information we want them to remember? And yes and no, it wasn't great. But can we use the landscape model then to construct these brochures such that they are recalling the information we want them? And the landscape model should give us clues on how to construct brochures where people are remembering things more the way we want them to. We didn't do a good job of creating situational models. That was clear. It's just clear. And so in the future, that's what we really wanted to do. And I've already talked about that. We think that comprehension has a lot of interesting implications across a lot of different domains. We've looked at it with framing, product placements. Now we're using it with health brochures. We looked at that basic comprehension of narrative text and entertainment text. We're wanting to look at how does that relate to transportation, which is Bucel and Bolanczyk's model, essentially. We think that the dual code landscape is an important theoretical development out of this work, and I think it points to the fact that communication scholars need to be more interested in that visual, which we tend to ignore. And then we think the merger with the event indexing model, which is in its very earliest stages. We're working on a comm theory paper right now, but we have a couple more data sets that are more sophisticated, and this is important. We're wanting to look at more at that event segmentation. How is it we get people to see things as events, so that will influence, again, what people are remembering, and that's very important, we think, for the health pushers. And as I also mentioned, we're wanting to model conversation. And in doing that, we want to take it to social network sites. And can we predict people's memory for and understanding of information they're getting on social network sites? And then the other thing is cultural models, which I talked about before, but cultural models is shared understandings of things. So we've done this with romance, where we brought in college students and we demonstrated a shared understanding of that. And one of the things we can do with the methodology we use is we have very strong evidence that this is shared knowledge, but then we can also measure the degree to which an individual is, as they talk about in that literature, consonant with. Do they map onto that knowledge or not, or are they deviant from it? In the original study, which is right now I'm revising for CR, we demonstrated that people who watched, the two dimensions for romance that emerged was physical, non-physical. So that's an important component of romance, and then time, short-term versus long-term. And we had like 80 different concepts within that map. And these were two dimensions that emerged. What we found is that individuals, males or females, who watch a lot of romantic comedies, read a lot of romantic novels, go to a lot of beauty websites, marriage magazines. So it was a cultivation study, but we did it across media. People who engage in a lot of these more idealistic romantic content do not map well onto that physical component. They're divergent in that physical component. Think about Sleepless in Seattle. How much physical contact is there between the two people who are in love? None, until the last 10 seconds of the movie. When you go into beauty sites, there's nothing there, or wedding sites, there's nothing there about the physical component of romance, even though that's a critical part of our understanding of romance. When you're in love with somebody, you touch them, you hold hands, you hug them, you do other things that I won't talk about in a talk. But that's not part of this type of media. But what we're wanting to do in the future is use that as, this is our knowledge of this genre of programming. Does that influence then how people comprehend it and interpret it? And so that's what we want to do in the future with that.